Today we wanted to cover how we can think about fatigue from a coach's lens. So when we're thinking about fatigue from a coach's lens, we can kind of classify fatigue in a few ways. But if we wanted to break it down super simple, there's two major categories of training or training parts of the training structure that we may think about fatigue in a little bit of a different way. So the first one is further away from competition, when we are building a baseline or building more tolerance to workload. And then there's closer to competition, where we're expressing strength and where we really want to kind of monitor fatigue a little bit more closely.
So I guess we can just dive into each section and we can talk about more of like the off season and further away from competition and what we're sort of looking for with fatigue markers and what sort of monitoring fatigue actually sort of looks and means. And then we can dive into the competition side of things and how we monitor fatigue for that, because it is a little bit different. I think the first thing, like Kelly touched on, is like when we're more in that sort of off season or sort of building phase, we're looking to potentially throw in a little bit more volume, build some work capacity, some tolerance, all those sorts of things. And during those times when we're throwing more work at someone, we can expect there to be some more fatigue associated with the extra work we're giving them, right? So I guess the outcome here, or the things we're looking at from this lens, is that fatigue isn't a bad thing and it's not necessarily a good thing either. It's just a byproduct of training. And when you do more work, you have more fatigue. It's just kind of how it goes. Now this is very case dependent or person dependent. You could give the same people the same workload and have a very different result in terms of how tired they get. So it is important to monitor the actual individual and what their response is to the specific amount of work you're giving them. But regardless, it stays the same. When you give someone work, they get tired, they get fatigued. So one of the big things we're looking at here is with fatigue, and we're monitoring it in the off season, we're not super concerned with expressing top end strength and sort of highlighting what kind of strength capabilities we have. We're more concerned with building it. And there's this kind of fine line that we like to tread, where in the off season we're increasing all this work, we're doing extra volume, we're generating more fatigue. The performance may not necessarily be there, but we also don't want to be regressing, going backwards in our training. We actually want our training to be meaningful, and we don't want it to be too clouded by so much fatigue, by doing too much work, that our training is now not actually getting us anywhere and we're just spinning our wheels.
So when it comes to off-season training, what we're talking about is like when the athlete is more than 20 weeks away and probably still more than 12 weeks away. So in that time, some ways that we can work to find the maximum recoverable volume is add more volume. When it comes to programming or progressive overload, there's usually going to be people who really respond to higher volumes and some people that don't. Until we've got the time in the year cycle to be able to test these theories, we need to be able to play with these variables, being volume, intensity, frequency, to find and discover the best programming structure for an athlete. This can change as an athlete evolves, as an athlete gets stronger, as an athlete may be injured, all these other variables. So when it comes to prescribing volume, we need to start in a way where layering on it as an approach. So some ways that we can do that, kind of control fatigue a little bit, are things like adding a rep each week to the first intro block and keeping the RPE the same. What that does is it's creating a work adaptation cycle. Typically after a competition, especially if it is directly after a competition, the athlete will come in detrained. So volume is going to start low. Fatigue is probably a little bit high from the comp, but fatigue is more neural at this point, and it's more of a feeling like Bambi under the bar because they've been at such a high intensity for a while that coming back and doing sets of 10 is really not productive. If we've got a long training cycle, that first block or even that first two blocks, just add a rep a week just to see where that baseline volume is at starting. Then we can add intensity on top of that. That is something that I've been doing a lot recently with some of my top end athletes, because what that does, it kind of induces an overall adaptation effect without pushing loads of volume too soon, and then they can jump up in volume while controlling fatigue. There's other general ways that we can do that with controlling fatigue, with like fatigue singles, putting doubles before singles, just to make sure that there is a cap on that top end, because we know that the athlete is carrying a fair bit of fatigue at this time. We don't need them to express their top end. They might still need the feeling of it, but it's important that we keep it under control in this time so that they don't run into a wall. And it's easier to see fatigue markers that far out from competition if you are controlling the amount of volume you're prescribing and adding in those constraints, which means that they won't hit a wall so far out from comp, because I've had that happen before, and it can really derail progress if you haven't got it right that far out, and then you're forced to push through fatigue anyway.
Yeah, so I guess the overall kind of takeaway there would be, don't do too much too soon, so that we don't just go from, this tapered competition effect where, that taper week is very low volume, and then we have all this intensity on comp day, and then, like Kelly said, it's just not productive. So there are ways to kind of intro and ease people into these new volumes, and then from there we're just monitoring, okay, is training still productive when we add an extra rep, or when we add an extra set, or an extra day of squatting, or whatever it may be. When we add in this extra work, however that looks, is training still productive? And if yes, then cool, we haven't got too much fatigue, we've got enough. So I think the other big thing to sort of look at or sort of recognize is that you're in control of how much fatigue you give an athlete. So you can do this not just by volume, but you can also do this by your RP prescriptions, just your intensity that you prescribe someone. If you're giving someone a whole lot of RP 8s or even 9s, that is a lot of hard work, regardless of how many reps it is. That's just something hard and heavy for someone. So that is another thing to consider as well, is like, you might look at your program and say, well, I'm not really giving this person that much work. They're not really generating that much fatigue. But again, you've got individual response, and you've also got to look at how hard you're working this person with your RP prescriptions. Take note of what you're doing. Take note that you are the person in control of fatigue. If someone is fatiguing really quickly, or gassing out at the end of a block, take a look not only at your volume, but your prescriptions, your block length. Do any of these things need to actually change? And these are great things to figure out in the off season when you're playing with this extra workload that you are giving an athlete.
Yeah, and one big thing that is important to remember at this time out is stringing blocks of training together as an athlete and a coach is actually really hard without running into something. So some ways we can mitigate this is what I was touching on before, but other ways is don't be afraid to have a washout block. Like if you just had 3 really good blocks of training and you're a coach and you're going, oh, if I think I push one more, I know they're going to PR, but we're 20 weeks away from a competition, you may then restart your intro in a washout period, because you know that that person has just gotten stronger. If you give in to temptation and then go, okay, let's just keep going, you might run into this brick wall of not knowing what to do, because all of a sudden you're 10 weeks out from comp, they're telling you that they're really tired, and all of a sudden you've got to chuck in this really big deload. Don't be afraid to induce some fatigue when you're further away out from competition, to see how the athlete bounces back. That's essentially what we need to do in a peak and taper. So if you're further out from competition, you need to see your athlete working hard and see what it does to their training. Some people can work really hard in volume and then just tank. Or some people can work really low in volume in terms of workload or how they feel, and then just skyrocket. But unless we play with those variables, we're not gonna really know what works further out. So it's hard, then it makes the comp prep itself quite hard.
To touch on competition prep then, and how that kind of differs when we're looking at fatigue, I think the easiest way to sort of quantify that is to just say like, okay, well, in these competition blocks, obviously fatigue is going to be a byproduct, because these are the blocks where we're actually pushing intensity the hardest, but we're also really monitoring fatigue in these blocks, because now is the time to showcase and highlight the strength we've built in the last sort of, let's say, 20 weeks to go off that number. And we don't want fatigue to mask or, overshadow, overbear on this block, because this is the block where we need to express it and not actually have it get in the way of what we're doing. So I think this is where the peaking approach differs. So if you're running the block into comp, you might be like, sweet, like fatigue's fine, because by the time you hit that week 4, week 5 fatigue, that's when the athlete's strongest, and we don't want to wash away too much fatigue, because then they're going to be detrained. Versus if we're doing a traditional peak and taper, where we need fatigue there in the first place, so we have something to taper away from and super compensate onto the platform. So we're constantly monitoring fatigue. It just depends what lens we're looking at it from to make the decisions in the competition prep.
And where I was saying before with needing to test the variables and how they're responding further out from comp, this is where it really matters, because we need to understand how far we can push an athlete, right? I think that every coach has made the mistake of pushing their athlete too far on the last week of the peak, then just tapering into feeling nothing. And that is a mistake to learn, because every coach has made that mistake. And it happens. So for a lot of athletes, when they're carrying that much fatigue in peaking, overshooting an RP8, making it a 9.5, just completely derails their progress 2 weeks out. And coming back from that in the taper takes a lot of skill in understanding how your client responds to fatigue. So some ways that we can mitigate this when we're in a peaking cycle is to look at what we've done previously in terms of volume, and we want to kind of prescribe something similar, but monitoring that really top peak volume. Some athletes will be able to hit their peak volume 3 weeks out, whereas some athletes would only be able to hit it 6 weeks out, and then the peaking block goes to a little bit more of that, a little bit under that volume, but the intensity is higher. Where I'm getting at with this is it's just in that period of maybe it's 3, 4, 5 weeks. Usually it's looking around 3 or 4 weeks, depending on how strong the athlete is. We're just asking, how does it feel in your back? How does it feel in your hands? And then as a coach, you're just looking at bar speed. Does it start slowing down? You know, has your volume dropped from the block before and it starts slowing down? Or have you kept volume the same and it started slowing down? Those are the variables that you're looking at that close to competition. A great example would be that you've been hitting 5 sets of 5 on bench for the whole of your existence, but then all of a sudden in the peaking block, it becomes really, really hard. As a coach, that's kind of normal. I wouldn't freak out. 5 sets of 5 may become 5 sets of 4 for the last 2 weeks, just to make sure that that fatigue is looked after at the end. Whereas if you're further away out from competition, you might just keep running those 5 sets of 5, and mental note that moving forward, you may need to pull that 5 sets of 5 back just to 5 sets of 4 for the last week of the block. Those are the little markers that you can look at when it comes to fatigue that can give you the view of what you need to know in the peak.
Well, I think the only thing that's kind of left to touch on here is, as coaches, is the trap of not listening to your athletes, but not just ignoring them either. So the subjective feedback your athlete offers you around fatigue is super important, and it's really great information to have. If they say they feel tired, that's obviously meaning that they feel tired. But if you know you've gone from 50 sets a week of bench press down to 30 or something like that, that's some extreme example, and they're still saying that they're tired, it may just be the fact that this is the peaking block, they're lifting some really heavy weights and they're getting, there's externals, there's sleep, there's making weight, there's all these things going on. You may know, like, okay, they're reporting fatigue, but based off the data you have, based on your previous off-season kind of work, you know that that's not the case. Then there's a sort of, this decision to make of, do you trust your gut and know what the paper is telling you, like the program, or do you trust the verbal feedback from your athlete? And I think this is where it's, again, case by case. Does the athlete have a lot of experience? Have you been working with them for a while? Do they have a general good understanding of what fatigue feels like versus just being tired? Because I can tell you from experience and from like coaching people that you can have someone say they feel super run down and tired, and then 2 days later they'll go into a squat session and just smoke a PR like, it's the strongest they've ever been. So there's this really fine line to tread when we're monitoring fatigue. We need to listen and take on this feedback, but we also need to know and trust our gut instincts as a coach of like, no, this person's in a good spot right now, and I'm not going to strip away any more volume. You just end up with nothing, and the person fizzles out. You can't taper because you're already at like taper volumes almost, and you kind of run out of room, right? So there is this fine line of managing fatigue versus just being too locked into the program and what's on the paper versus way too much subjective feedback from the athlete.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, again, I know I keep harping on about this in this clip, but that's when understanding the difference between, training fatigue and outside external fatigue for each athlete is super important. And you will get to know that further away from competition, and remembering that further away from competition and how the athlete reports fatigue, experiences fatigue, can really help you to make your decisions in the last 2 to 3 weeks, because the last 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out, 1 week out being the taper week, those are super important times, because any little variable you change can go either way if you don't understand the markers of fatigue for your athlete and what they respond to. And that's where we can use those constraints and variables and, and then take into consideration the subjective feedback. If you've given your athlete 5 sets of 10 and they're flying with it, but then those 5 sets of 10 become, 2 sets 8 in the peaking block, you probably kind of, taken away what made them feel really strong by expecting them to feel fatigue. Whereas not everyone's going to feel that way. So I guess where I'm getting at here is really understanding what that looks like for each of your athletes in terms of how they feel it, what happens to their performance at that time. Because as Dave just said, some athletes thrive on it, whereas some athletes cannot add any more. And it's really important to understand that. I'm also a big believer in that there will come a time that there is more workload that needs to happen, but understanding when that time is based on all these variables is super important.